Hello, my name is Zainab, and I'm going to be talking through my comparative multimedia project or texting conversation, where I discuss the Joy Luck Club and I compare it to a few different texts. And I'll be explaining a few slides that I had prepared on that as well. So, the idea that I'm coming into this with is what I like to coin the inherent female struggle, which means that to be woman is to inherently fight against a system that wasn't made for you, and how this is represented across different minority groups. And ultimately, if a society is not made for us, how do we find love, acceptance, and peace within ourselves when we are constantly trying to seek admiration from others? So the idea is that minority women specifically are inherently defying what society deems as acceptable or normal, and they have to find a way to weave through this world in a world that treats them like aliens. And on top of that, they're also trying to find their own paths to liberation through their own culture and cultures in which they don't belong to. And for this multimedia project, I wanted to explore that really complex and painful feeling of isolation that a lot of minority women face when they live between these two worlds and they're trying to navigate it. And at the same time, also see how that applies to different cultures and how they differ or assimilate so that we can have conversations on how we as women treat our place in the world, as we as minority women treat our place in the world, and ultimately what is the real getaway from this problem that we tend to face. So, the book that I had read on my own was The Joy Luck Club. I was introduced to it in 10th grade as an optional choice text, and I read a different book. I never ended up reading that book. But it had stayed on my TBR because my teacher had recommended it so highly. And I finally got the opportunity to read it, and it is a very, very good book. It strings together the lives of four American Chinese girls and their mothers that are intertwined through something called the Joy Luck Club, which is a club that had started when their mothers immigrated from China. And from that immigration, they brought their own set of cultural expectations, traumas, and notions of how their daughters' lives should be. And with that, their daughters are trying to find their way through life to abide with both Western and Chinese expectations, and also the idea of staying true to your own self as well. So, in the Joy Luck Club, there's a fundamental misunderstanding between the girls and their mothers, as the girls try to search for identity and their mothers try to give them these Chinese expectations when they don't live in a Chinese world. And I want to explore this theme that I have called the search for identity within oppressive social structures, because I feel like it's specific enough that it applies to this same shared feeling, but it's broad enough to allow us to explore it throughout different cultural backgrounds and different types of social structures. So, this was a really big inspiration for me because I wanted to explore how we often feel similar themes of loneliness, misunderstanding, emotional drainage, and also a sense of determination, because in every woman I feel like there's a desire and a need to be authentic, but there's also a sense of restriction and trying to navigate that tightrope. And that is ultimately poses the question, how do I exist and thrive in a society that hasn't been built with my existence in mind? And that is what we are going to try to answer today throughout the different types of media I present to you. So the first one is going to be my lyric or song that I have. This is SZA's Normal Girl. SZA is an R&B and rap artist, and she is known nowadays for the level of vulnerability she brings into her artistry and work. It doesn't feel over produced. It feels very raw and close to the heart, and it expresses feelings that can sometimes be hard to explain. And the song explores how, even in love, there feels a need to change oneself so that they can abide from what a lover would want or what they would think that they would want. So she says in the first few lyrics, I want to be the type of girl you'd take home to your mama, the type of girl I know your fellas they'd be proud of. She sings it much nicer than that. But she's basically saying, like, I want to live in this world where you're proud of me, where you want to show me off, where society has deemed me acceptable, but I want to be this normal girl, but I'm not, and I'll never be her because that's not who I am. And not only to be misunderstood is draining, demanding, frustrating, all of those things, but I think at its core, it's very sad it's sad not to be understood for who you are, because you can't expect that person to love you really if they don't know or they don't accept who you truly are. And I think that it connects a lot with how the women in the Joy Luck Club feel, not only the daughters but the mothers as well. The sense of misunderstanding and the almost grief that comes from that lost experience, the language barriers with the mothers, the cultural barriers with the daughters, even the sense of time between those two generations. And I think it connects to the other texts as well, as it prevents minority women from living authentically, and it brings about this sense of pain that makes you want to keep chasing society expectations, and it's so hard to break from that. So I feel like Normal Girl really brings about that problem. Like, I wish I was normal, I wish I fit in, I wish that I didn't have to do this, but I do. The next one I'm going to be talking about is a nonfiction text. It's a memoir called The Woman Warrior, Memoirs of Girlhood Among Ghosts. It is a book by Maxine Hong Kingston, and it talks about her experiences also as a child of Chinese immigrant parents, similar to the Joy Luck Club, and her connection to a mythical legendary warrior woman called Fa Mulan. But at the same time, there's a theme of shame and silence, because her mother tells her these other stories and myths and folk tales about women who try to step out of their boundaries and are met with dire consequences, and ultimately carries the idea that a woman should be silent. And that contrasts the power of Fa Mulan. And this carries a sense of constriction throughout the book, and it's very similar to the tone of Joy Luck Club, not only in the cultural heritage that they have, but also in the theme that I was talking about before, is that there's that sense of restriction and trying to navigate that. But also, I feel like it connects to a piece that I'm going to be talking about later called The Two Fridas, where we see that sense of duality in our heritage, where we're not fully in one or we're not fully in another. And that's what I'm going to be talking about right now. The Two Fridas is a very amazing portrait, and I feel like every time you look at it, you can aspire to get something new out of it. But it is a self-portrait of Frida Kahlo and an exploration of her identity. So I think it's important to note that at this time, she was fresh, or maybe even continuing through, a divorce with her husband, and she was obviously in a lot of emotional pain. And this painting represents the two sides of her identity: her European identity that she had formulated for her relationship, that's clad in white, much like a wedding dress, as I'm looking now, actually, and the Mexican culture that she had retained, that is represented by the green skirt. And I think there can be many interpretations of this, but I think one can be that she had changed herself to be so different for her relationship in society, and all she had gotten in return was her heart being ripped out, And while it does carry that sense of visceral depression and grief that the Joy Luck Club can sometimes carry, or Normal Girl by SZA can carry, we're starting to see a different feeling. We're starting to see a sense of comfort as we see the Mexican version of, I want to say the Mexican version of herself, the version of herself that represents her Mexican culture, is holding her hand throughout all of this, and her heart is intact. It is a painful feeling to be rejected from society, but we're starting to see, be a liberating one, because your sense of self, your sense of cultural identity as a minority woman will always be there for you. Her Mexican cultural self remains. And in the Joy Luck Club, the daughters at the end of the book find a sense of comfort in returning to their mother's homeland and returning to her culture and their Chinese heritage. Even if it is harsh on them, it is accepting of them. And it doesn't provide the sense of optimism that I'm going to get into, Their Eyes Were Watching God, but it presents a starting of a sense of peace when we see this inner struggle. And finally, I'm going to talk about Their Eyes Were Watching God. This was a book we had read in class, and it explores the life of Janie and her multiple relationships that she uses to feel whole. And ultimately, the book at first glance can seem kind of shallow, I suppose. She goes through all of these relationships. She gets out of this relationship tragically, but in the end, she's very happy to be by herself. But I think it forces you to look back at the beginning and ask yourself, why was she searching for those relationships in the first place? Well, the idea is that what she really wanted was a sense of true understanding. And she had gone through those relationships because that is what society had told her that she needed to do, was to conform to societal expectations, find a good husband, find someone who loves you, and someone will finally understand you. However, I think that once she finally relieves herself of all of these relationships, and instead of grief she finds a sense of peace, it's because she realizes that that true understanding can only come from herself. It is isolating, being alone, but it's also so freeing. And her story ultimately ends in a sense of optimism that being ostracized from society isn't as bad if you had finally accepted that they cannot offer anything to you, and saying that only I can understand myself truly, and only I can understand my lived experience, and people who live in my culture can understand my lived experience. That is a path for her own happiness rather than from men who can never understand that. So, what are my final thoughts on this? So, I had come into this project looking at how different groups of women navigate through a society that isn't built for them. Whether it's a society that values certain physical features, a society that values certain cultural features. I found how, whether it's black women, Chinese women, or other women of color, do that and have that lived experience. I also found that there is a resolution to this issue. We don't have to live like this in between these two worlds and having all of this angst for the rest of our lives. And we see that from SZA's Normal Girl to Joy Luck Club, being separated from what we want from society is difficult and painful. If we keep chasing that, it is impossible to obtain it. And it is emotionally exhausting because that world isn't made for you, for your experience. And that is literally just to exist as a minority woman. However, to realize the true extent of happiness, we need to look inward and ask ourselves a question. How can a society that doesn't seek to understand you love you? How can a person that doesn't understand you love you? How can you love something that you can't understand? And when we ask ourselves our question, we come to the answer that no, you cannot. You cannot love something that you cannot understand. And if you do not love that thing, you love something else. And when you realize that, there is a huge sense of liberation, that society isn't seeking to understand you because it doesn't want to conform to you. So why would you seek love and acceptance from it? So we see that in the two Fridas, where she is being kind of backstabbed by society and by her husband. Her heart is being ripped out. Her European self that she had created for this is being put through so much grief, but her cultural self holds onto her as a sense of stability. And finally, in Their Eyes Were Watching God, we see, I think, a sense of resolution to this whole conflict that I've explored throughout all of these texts, that Janie's sense of liberation and freedom and love had only ever come from understanding herself and the acknowledgement that these men can never really truly understand her, so they can never really truly love her. So to answer the question that I had proposed in the beginning, how do I thrive in a society that wasn't built with my existence in mind? The answer is we cannot depend on that society to provide us with love and happiness. We can't depend on it because that society isn't made for us. As is the experience of the immigrant or the minority female, we must work in our own groups and by ourselves, and maybe even 10 times harder, to find an understanding within ourselves of who we are and what we want. And only then will true liberation and happiness come, when we stop expecting society to conform for us when we are chasing them. So those were my final thoughts that had come from this multimedia project. As a minority female myself that doesn't necessarily uphold to societal expectations of maybe appearance or other things, I thought this was a very interesting look at the cultural identity of minority women and really providing some sort of resolution of how we can, find a sense of understanding within ourselves, but also within other women who have this experience. and ultimately telling ourselves that yes, self-love is necessary in this case for anyone, but particularly here when society cannot offer you it. And realizing that is where we truly start to see liberation. So that's me done talking. I hope you enjoyed my project, and that is all I have to offer you today.